Hello, this is my first YouTube video. I'm going to be doing ghost stories and things like this. So anyway, this is the first one, and it's The Waxwork by A.M. Burrage. As the last visitors left Mariner's Waxworks at closing time, the manager sat in his office talking to Raymond Hewson. The manager was well dressed and looked like the successful businessman that he was. Raymond Hewson's clothes were good, but were now old and tired. He was small and thin, with untidy brown hair, and he looked like a man who tried hard to be successful, but usually failed. "A lot of people," said the manager, "have asked to spend the night in the murderous room. It's usually young men, and we always refuse. But you're a newspaper reporter, and that's different. People will read about the waxworks and want to come and visit it, so that's good for business. Which newspaper do you work for?" "Well, I don't work for just one newspaper. I'll write the story and then I'll sell it to one of them. The Morning Echo will probably buy it." "And what kind of story will you write?" "Oh, a frightening story, of course." "All right then, Mr. Hewson," said the manager, "and I'll pay you £10 when I see your story in the newspaper. As I said, it'll be good for business. But you won't have an easy night, you know. I know those waxwork figures very well. I've seen them dressed and undressed. In the daytime I can walk round them and feel nothing, but I couldn't spend the night alone with them." "Why not?" asked Hewson. "I don't know. There isn't any reason. They were all horrible people, but these are just waxworks, not ghosts. It's just that their eyes seem to follow you. There's an unpleasant feeling in that room, and I think you're going to have a very uncomfortable night." Hewson knew that. In fact, he was afraid, but he had a wife and family, and he needed the money very badly. So he smiled at the manager and said, "Well, I know it won't be very comfortable, because it's not a hotel room, but I don't think your waxworks will worry me very much." "All right then," said the manager. "I think all the visitors have left now. I'll just telephone to say that the figures must not be covered tonight, and then I'll take you down and show you everything." He spoke into the telephone for a few minutes and turned to Hewson again. "Please don't smoke when you're in the murderer's room. We thought there was a fire down there tonight. Someone rang the fire bell, but it was a mistake. And now, if you're ready, we'll go down." Hewson followed the manager downstairs and through rooms where people were putting the covers on waxwork figures of kings, queens, and all kinds of famous people. The manager stopped once and asked a man in uniform to put an armchair in the murderer's room. "It's the best we can do," he said to Hewson. "I hope you'll be able to get some sleep." They went down some steps and into the murderer's room. It was a big room with a high ceiling, and the lights were not bright enough to reach the shadows in the corners. It was a room where you spoke in whispers and looked behind you all the time, wondering what was there. The waxwork murderers stood in their places with numbered tickets at their feet. They looked just like the man next door. Nothing strange or different about them at all. The manager walked round with Hewson and showed him some of the more interesting figures. Hewson stopped in front of one of them. "Who's that?" he asked quietly. The figure was of a tall, thin man with a little moustache and glasses. Hewson did not know why, but the figure frightened him, and he didn't want to look at it again. "Who is it?" he asked again. "That," said the manager, "is Dr. Burrage." Hewson knew the name, but he couldn't remember why. "What did he do?" he asked. "He was French," the manager replied. "All Paris was afraid of him. He was a doctor by day and a murderer by night. He killed because he enjoyed killing. He always used a razor. The police knew it was him, but he was too clever for them, and they never caught him. He just disappeared. The police think he killed himself, but they never found his body." Hewson turned his head away. "I don't like him at all," he said. "What terrible eyes he has." "Yes, the figure is very well done. You can feel the eyes holding you, which is very true to life, because Burrage hypnotized the people he killed. That was the only way he could do it. He was a small man, as you see, but nobody ever tried to fight him or to escape." "I thought I saw him move," said Hewson. His voice shook a little as he spoke. The manager smiled. "Well, we won't lock you in. You can come upstairs when you've had enough. I'm sorry the room is so dark, but you can understand why we keep it like that." The man who brought the armchair down to the murderer's room thought it was all very amusing. "Where shall I put it, sir?" he asked. "Which murderer do you want to have a little talk with tonight?" Hewson smiled, and for a moment his fear disappeared. "Oh, anywhere," he said. "I'll move it later." "Well, good night, sir," the man said, I'm upstairs if you need me. Don't let them touch you with their cold hands." Hewson laughed and said good night. It was going to be easy, he thought, but he pushed the armchair round and made sure that its back was towards Dr. Bourdette. For some reason he was more afraid of him than the others. Suddenly he realised how silent everything was, now that the man in uniform had gone back upstairs. He understood then that it was not going to be easy, after all. In the low light, the figures looked just like living people, and it seemed unnatural not to hear them breathing, or making any of the little sounds that people usually make. The air was as silent and as still as death. The only thing that moved was his own shadow. He stared bravely at the figures in front of him. They were only waxworks, but he could feel the eyes of Dr. Bourdette on his back, and it was difficult not to turn around and look. "Come on," he said to himself. "If I turn and look, it will show that I'm afraid." And then another voice in his head spoke to him. "It's because you are afraid that you won't turn and look at him," it said. The two voices argued silently for a moment, and at last Hewson turned his chair a little and looked behind him. Among all the figures, the figure of the awful little doctor stood out strangely. Perhaps it was because the light shone down straight on him. For one horrible second, Hewson's eyes met the doctor's, and then he turned away in fear. "He's only a waxwork like the rest of you," Hewson said. "You're all only waxworks." It was true. They were only waxworks, but waxworks don't move. Hewson hadn't seen them move, but he thought that in the moment when he turned around to look behind him, the figures had changed place a little, but perhaps he hadn't put the chair back where it was before. For a moment Hewson stopped breathing, but then he said to himself, "Calm down, don't be stupid." He took a notebook from his pocket and wrote quickly. Everywhere deathly silent. Dr. Bourdette's eyes. Figures seem to move when you're not watching them. He closed the book suddenly and looked around quickly over his right shoulder. He hadn't seen or heard anything, but he felt that the figures had moved again. But of course they hadn't moved. He was being stupid. Or was he? He stood up. He'd had enough. He was going. He wasn't going to spend the night with a lot of waxworks which moved when you took your eyes off them. Hewson sat down again. This was stupid. They were only waxworks and they couldn't move. He must remember that, and all would be well. Then why was there that silent, uncomfortable feeling all around him? He turned round quickly and found Dr. Bourdette's eyes on him. Then, very quickly, he turned back and looked at the others. Ha! He'd nearly caught them all that time. "Just be careful, all of you," he shouted. "If I see one of you move, I'll break you into little pieces. Do you hear?" He ought to go, he told himself. He already had enough for his story, but the man upstairs would laugh at him. Perhaps the manager would not give him the £10 which he needed so much. Perhaps the newspaper would hear about it and not buy his story. He thought of his wife. Was she awake? Was she thinking about him? She'd laugh when he told her all about this. This was too much. The waxworks were not only moving now, they were breathing. Somebody was breathing. Was it his own breathing? He sat listening. Nothing. It was his own breathing. Or had something realised that he was listening and stopped breathing? Hewson turned his head quickly and looked all around him, his eyes wild with fear. Everywhere he saw waxwork faces, and everywhere he felt they had just moved, and he hadn't seen them. They were like children in class, whispering and laughing behind their teacher's back, and stopping when the teacher looked at them. He must stop this. They were only waxworks. He tried to think of something to bring him back to the real world of London by day. He was Raymond Hewson, an unsuccessful newspaperman, but he was a real man, and these figures were made of wax. They weren't real. He tried to remember a funny story that he had heard yesterday, but he could feel Dr. Bourdette's eyes on him. Finally, he turned his chair round to look at Dr. Bourdette face to face, right into those awful hypnotic eyes. His own eyes stared wildly, and his mouth was fixed in a terrible smile of fear. "You moved," he cried. "Yes, you did. I saw you." Then he sat there without moving, staring straight before him, like a man who has been turned to ice. Dr. Bourdette moved calmly and slowly. He stepped carefully down from his place and came towards Hewson. Then he smiled and said, "Good evening." "It was only when I heard you talking to the manager," he continued, speaking in excellent English, "that I realised I was going to have someone with me here tonight. You cannot move or speak because I have hypnotised you. You can do only what I tell you, but you can hear me. I realise that you are a little afraid, but have no fear. I am not a wax figure which has come to life, but Dr. Bourdette himself." He stopped for a minute, then continued, There are reasons why I must live in England, he said, and this evening when I was near this building, I saw a policeman looking at me a little too closely. I thought that he was going to follow me and start asking questions, so I hid in the crowd and came in here. I paid my money and came into this room. Then I had a very clever idea. I shouted, "Fire!" Someone rang the fire bell and everyone ran out. When they had gone, I took the coat from my wax figure and hid the figure under the stairs. Then I took its place. Since then I have spent a very tiring evening. When people weren't looking at me, I was able to move a little and breathe deeply for a few seconds. One small boy screamed and shouted, "I saw him move!" But his parents were angry with him. "Don't tell lies," they said. I had to listen to the manager talking about me, of course, but he really does not understand me. I collect things, you see. Some people collect stamps. Some people collect old books. I collect necks. He stopped again for a moment and looked at Hewson's neck. He did not seem to like it. "You have a very thin neck," he said. "I like men with thick necks, thick, red necks." He took something from his pocket and moved it backwards and forwards across his left hand. "This is a little French razor," he said quietly. "You don't see many of them in England because they don't cut very deeply, but deeply enough. You will see that for yourself in a minute. Is the razor all right for you, sir?" He moved slowly towards Hewson. "Please lift your chin a little," he said. "Thank you. A little more. Just a little more. Ah, thank you, sir, thank you." At one end of the murderer's room there was a window. It was made of thick glass, but a little light from the morning sun came through it. This extra light only seemed to add to the horror in the room. The waxworks stood in their places, waiting for the crowds to come in and stare at them. In the middle of the room, Hewson sat still, with his chin up and his head resting against the back of the armchair. There was no wound on his neck, nor anywhere on his body, but he was cold and dead. Dr. Burrage stood in his place and watched the dead man. He showed no feelings. He did not move. He could not move. But then, after all, he was only a waxwork. Thank you very much for listening. See you again sometime. Bye bye.